All right, today we're going to dive into a really fascinating idea. It's from an article that tries to connect what's going on inside our own heads with that feeling a lot of us have. That sense that society is just getting more negative, more divided.
Have you ever just felt like the world is getting darker? The article we're looking at today kicks off with that exact question. And it really gets at that feeling so many of us have, right? That something's just off. There's this tension in the air. But here's the twist. Instead of blaming the usual suspects like politics or the economy, this theory points the finger inward. It looks at a really powerful idea from psychology.
And that powerful idea is something called the shadow. Now, if you've heard of the psychoanalyst Carl Jung, this is one of his big ones. The whole argument here is that if we can get a handle on this hidden part of ourselves, it might just be the key to understanding all the chaos we're seeing out there in the world.
Okay, so what is the shadow, really? Well, think of it like this. It's all the stuff about ourselves we'd rather not admit to. The envy, the anger, the laziness, all those impulses that we shove down deep inside because they just don't fit with the good person we're trying to be. And here's the thing that Jung was really clear on. Everybody has one. It's not a flaw, it's just part of being human.
Yeah, this really lays it all out, doesn't it? It's like we're all living these two lives. You've got your public self. That's the polished, polite version we show everyone at work or on social media. And then you've got the shadow self. That's the messy, hidden, instinctive part. We pour so much energy into keeping up that public front, but the shadow, it's always there, just under the surface.
And that's where the problem starts, which this pressure cooker analogy captures perfectly. You can't just ignore your shadow. Trying to suppress all those darker feelings, well, it doesn't make them go away. It's like clamping the lid on a boiling pot. The pressure just builds and builds and builds until eventually it has to explode. And that explosion often looks like resentment or a sudden outburst of anger or just totally irrational behavior.
So this all leads to the central point of the article. We're basically at a crossroads. We have a choice. We can keep trying to suppress the shadow, which we just saw doesn't work out so well, or we can try something else entirely. We can take the path of integration, which the author argues is the only real way to find any kind of balance.
Now, this is maybe the most important point to get right. Integration is not indulgence. This isn't a free pass to just let your worst impulses run wild. No way. It's actually the opposite. It's about looking your own capacity for, say, anger or selfishness right in the eye, acknowledging it's there so that you can consciously choose not to act on it. It's about gaining real control, not giving in to chaos.
And you can see the two paths laid out side by side here. Suppression, that's just denial. It creates this kind of forced performative goodness that's super brittle. It's just waiting to crack. But integration, that's about awareness. It leads to real discipline, real strength, because it's built on self-knowledge. It's really the difference between pretending you're good and actually choosing to be good, which are two very different things.
Okay, so let's zoom out. How does this personal, psychological stuff connect back to that feeling that the whole world is getting darker? Well, the core idea here is pretty simple when you think about it. A society is just a whole bunch of individuals. So if you have millions and millions of people who are all suppressing their own shadows, all walking around with this intense inner imbalance, where do you think all that pressure goes? It has to go somewhere. And the theory is it manifests on a massive collective scale. It becomes social turmoil.
But here's where it gets really interesting, and maybe even a little hopeful. The theory doesn't just predict doom and gloom. It says that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So all this rising darkness we think we're seeing, it might actually be a catalyst. It could be forcing a kind of awakening, a massive push for more self-reflection and more personal responsibility. It's almost like the society is trying to rebalance itself. All right, now we're getting into the part where the author applies this whole shadow theory to some very specific and pretty complex cultural trends. And just to be super clear, what we're about to go through is the author's specific analysis. It's their interpretation of events through this particular psychological lens.
One of the first big things the author points to as a symptom of this imbalance is declining birth rates in the West. And as you can see from this timeline, this isn't something that just happened overnight. It's been a long, slow trend for over a century, but it has really accelerated in recent decades. We're now at a point where many nations literally aren't having enough babies to replace their own populations.
So the author then tries to connect the dots between these falling birth rates and some other massive cultural shifts. They propose a link to the rise of modern feminism and the huge increase in women pursuing higher education and careers.
The argument put forward is that these changes, while empowering in many ways, have also seriously disrupted traditional social structures. This, according to the analysis, has led to shifting gender roles and, when combined with what the author calls a diminishing of traditional male spaces, creates a kind of societal instability.
So wow, we've gone from individual psychology all the way to these huge cultural trends. So what's the big takeaway from all this? What's the final message? Really, it all seems to boil down to one thing: a choice between conscious awareness and just blind reaction.
So let's just quickly recap the main points from the article. Number 1, trying to suppress human nature, whether it's just you or an entire society, is a recipe for instability. Number 2, the big problems out there in the world might just be a mirror reflecting a widespread psychological imbalance. Number 3, real strength isn't about pretending you have no flaws, it's about knowing them inside and out. And finally, the author really pushes us to look at these big cultural shifts critically through this psychological lens.
And that leaves us with a pretty heavy final question to think about. I mean, the entire foundation of this theory is that big societal problems are just a projection of what's going on inside millions of individuals. So, if that's true, if society really is out of balance, does that mean the only real way to start fixing it is to start with ourselves? It's a challenging thought for sure. Thanks for joining me on this one.
Welcome to the debate. Today, we are stepping into some pretty uncomfortable territory. Really, where individual psychology kind of bleeds into the structure of civilization itself. We're analyzing a piece of writing titled The Integrated Shadow and the Anatomy of Social Decay. And it is a provocative, perhaps even disturbing text. It suggests that the rising sense of darkness, instability, and, well, friction we feel in modern society is not just a series of random political events or economic bad luck. Instead, it argues this is a psychological inevitability, a direct consequence of our collective failure to integrate what Carl Jung called the shadow.
Yeah, it is certainly a heavy topic, and frankly, a bit of a grim one. The source material essentially argues that we are living through a massive projection of suppressed human nature. But I think the listener needs to be ready for a very specific and quite controversial type of argument here. The text isn't just talking about individual mental health or, why you might snap at your barista. It attempts to draw a straight line from suppressed, dark impulses to specific sociological trends, things like the changing roles of men and women, birth rates, and these broader culture wars.
Precisely. And that is exactly where the debate lies today. The central question we are tackling is this: is the social turmoil we see, the social decay, as the author puts it, the result of a society that has lost the ability to regulate its own darker nature? I am representing the position that the source material correctly identifies a causal link. When we suppress dark impulses through forced virtue, we don't eliminate them. We just ensure they erupt as social chaos. We are effectively sitting on a psychological pressure cooker.
And I come at it from a different angle entirely. I believe the author's grasp of the psychological framework, the Jungian shadow, is actually sound and valuable. However, I represent the position that applying this theory to complex structural changes like birth rates and feminism is deeply reductive. I believe the text risks conflating necessary social evolution with psychological pathology. It sees change, calls it decay, and then blames it on our minds rather than our economics, our technology, or our politics.
Let's begin by laying out our positions more fully. And I want to start by ensuring everyone understands the mechanism the text is actually proposing. We need to be clear on what the shadow is, because in pop culture, it is often treated like some sort of movie villain.
Right.
In Jungian terms, and as the text outlines, the shadow is simply the side of your personality that you do not wish to acknowledge. It contains your capacity for aggression, yes, but also your capacity for power, selfishness, primal drive, and even creativity. The argument here is that every human being possesses these tendencies. This is non-negotiable. The problem arises not because we have these dark impulses, but because we live in an era that demands we pretend they just don't exist.
The text uses the phrase forced virtue, which I actually found particularly striking.
Exactly. It argues that modern society demands a performance of goodness that is biologically impossible to maintain 24/7. We have curated online personas, strict social codes in the workplace, and a general cultural demand for constant agreeableness. When you spend all your energy suppressing the shadow just to appear socially acceptable, that energy creates an inner imbalance. Think of it like holding a beach ball underwater. You can do it for a while, but eventually your arms get tired and that ball is going to shoot up, and it usually hits you right in the face. My position is that the author is correct here. Our current social turmoil is that beach ball flying out of the water.
That is a vivid image. I'll give you that.
It is the reality we are living. We have traded true discipline for toxic positivity. We look away from the ugly parts of human nature, and because we look away, we lose the ability to control them. The text says integration is not indulgence. It implies that by failing to integrate these darker parts, we have lost our real strength, which comes from emotional regulation. We are basically seeing the societal version of a nervous breakdown caused by repression.
I appreciate that framing. And I don't disagree that repression is dangerous. If you bury your anger, it becomes resentment. That is Psychology 101. However, here is where I diverge. The text makes a massive leap from the psychological to the sociological. It validates the concept of the shadow, sure. But then it points to things like increased female education, workforce participation, and demographic shifts, and frames them essentially as symptoms of this decay.
You don't see the connection between the disruption of social roles and psychological stability?
I see a connection, but I interpret the causality completely differently. The text conflates suppressed emotions with structural changes. Viewing declining birth rates or the changing landscape of male spaces as a shadow eruption ignores the text's own alternative suggestion, which, by the way, I think is the stronger point, that this might be a psychological rebalancing process. My position is that the darkness the author describes might be a misinterpretation of the necessary friction that happens during a social transition. We aren't necessarily seeing a decay caused by a lack of virtue. We are seeing the stress test of a society expanding its definition of who gets to participate. To label that as a failure of integration feels like a misuse of the Jungian framework just to critique cultural shifts the author finds personally uncomfortable.
I see why you might mew about Wadi, but I think you are overlooking the sheer intensity of the friction. This isn't just mild growing pains. Let's move into our first core area of debate, integration versus toxic positivity. The text is very specific about why this mechanism is failing right now. It argues that pretending everything is fine is just another way of burying the shadow.
Which is a fair critique of superficial optimism. I mean, we've all been in corporate meetings or social gatherings where the vibes must remain positive at all costs, even if the building is burning down.
It is more than just annoying, though. The text argues it is dangerous. It is a critique of a society that fundamentally lacks emotional maturity. The text states, true maturity means facing uncomfortable truths. My argument is that we are currently lacking the discipline and emotional regulation the text calls for. Just look at public discourse. It is characterized by erratic behavior, immediate polarization, and a total lack of nuance. This is exactly what Jung predicted happens when the shadow is projected rather than integrated. If you cannot admit you have the capacity for harm, you project that harm onto your political enemies. You convince yourself they are the monsters so you can remain the saint. The instability isn't just change, it is a complete loss of control.
That is an interesting point, and I agree that projection is rampant in our political dialogue. It is always easier to demonize the other side than to look at our own complicity. But I would frame the uncomfortable truths differently. The text calls for conscious control, which I agree is lacking. But we have to ask, what specific uncomfortable truths does the author believe we are avoiding? You're suggesting that the toxic positivity is covering up a general human capacity for violence or harm. But looking closely at the text, the author seems to imply that the uncomfortable truth is that traditional hierarchies were better, or at least more stable.
I think that is an uncharitable reading of the text. The text isn't nostalgic, it is analytical regarding the human psyche.
Is it? I really have to ask if the shadow is being used here as a catch-all term for any social change the author finds disagreeable. When the text critiques performative goodness, is it attacking genuine hypocrisy, which we absolutely should attack, or is it attacking the modern attempt to be more inclusive? There's a fine line between toxic positivity and genuine empathy. I worry the text conflates the two. For example, is trying to use inclusive language repressing the shadow, or is it just trying to be polite in a pluralistic society?
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because the text focuses on the internal state of the individual. It says forced virtue creates inner imbalance. It isn't about the external policy of inclusion. It is about the internal psychology of the individual who is acting out a script of goodness without doing the internal work. The text says, strength requires discipline, self-knowledge, and integration, not denial. If our goodness is just a mask we wear because we are afraid of being canceled or judged, then it isn't goodness, it's fear, and fear leads to the shadow taking over. That is the decay the author is identifying. It is a hollowing out of genuine character in favor of a socially acceptable facade. We are creating a society of people who are terrified of their own thoughts.
That is a compelling argument. The idea that we are acting out of fear rather than conviction is a strong diagnosis of modern anxiety. It definitely explains the fragility we see everywhere. But have you considered that the mask might be the only thing holding the fabric together while we figure out the new rules? The text suggests that this inner imbalance mirrors societal imbalance. But perhaps the instability isn't because we are repressing our dark sides. Perhaps it is because the old containers for our identity, traditional roles, have shattered, and we haven't built new ones yet.
Well, that leads us directly into the second, and arguably most controversial, aspect of the source material: feminism and social structure. We have to pivot here because the text pivots. It moves from abstract psychology to very hard cultural examples. It explicitly cites declining birth rates over the past 2 centuries and the diminishing of male spaces.
Right, and this is exactly where the rubber meets the road. This is where the text moves from, basic psychology summaries to hot-button sociology.
I must point out that the text frames these not as random statistics, but as evidence of a disruption. The argument is that the expansion of female empowerment, while well-intentioned, has unintentionally disrupted traditional social structures. This isn't a moral condemnation of women, it is a systems analysis. The text links these shifts to ideological influence from academia and media. The argument is that we have upended the biological and social order, the yin and yang, if you will, without considering the shadow side of that revolution. And the data points, the collapse in birth rates, the confusion regarding male identity, suggest that the skeptical stance toward modern feminism mentioned in the material is justified. We disrupted the structure, and now we are dealing with the fallout.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that linkage. Let me tell you why. The text is drawing a massive correlation between contraception and education and social decay without actually proven causation. It lists these things: increased female education, workforce participation, and places them under the umbrella of things causing instability. It treats women entering the workforce as if it is a psychological pathology of society rather than an economic necessity or just a baseline desire for freedom.
But are they not causing instability? A collapsing birth rate is the literal definition of societal instability. If a society cannot reproduce itself, it effectively ends. That is an objective crisis, is it not?
It is a demographic shift, certainly, and a crisis for pension funds. But decay implies a rotting away of something healthy. I would argue that what the text calls diminishing male spaces and ideological influence are not evidence of a suppressed shadow erupting. They are the visible tension of a society in flux. The text actually mentions that social turmoil may be triggering awakening and self-reflection. It also suggests this could be a psychological rebalancing process.
It does say that, but it frames it as a possibility that requires a counterforce. It is basically saying, wake up before the car goes off the cliff.
Exactly. But consider this. Could the rise of female empowerment be the light counterforce to a previous historical imbalance? For centuries, you could argue the shadow of society was the active suppression of women. The collective unconscious of the West suppressed the feminine for millennia. Now that is being integrated, to use the author's own term, and it feels like chaos to those who benefited from the old order. To blame feminism for social decay seems to ignore that the previous structure had its own massive, completely unintegrated shadow.
That is an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The text isn't arguing for a return to the oppression of women. It is arguing that ideological extremes are dangerous. The author questions whether we are overcorrecting. That is the key word. And overcorrection is just another form of imbalance. If we go from suppressing women to diminishing men, which the text explicitly mentions regarding male spaces and identities, we haven't solved the problem. We have just inverted the shadow. Now men are the ones being asked to repress their nature, to be performatively good in a way that denies their reality. And that, according to the text, will lead to eruption. If you tell half the population that their natural instincts are toxic, you are essentially building a pressure cooker.
That is a fair interpretation of the risk of overcorrection. And I agree that if diminishing male spaces means suppressing healthy masculinity, that is a recipe for disaster. But the text groups contraception and changing gender roles alongside social decay. That feels less like a critique of overcorrection and more like a nostalgia for a time when biology dictated destiny. It feels like the author is saying things were stable when everyone knew their place, which sure is true, but that stability came at a very high cost.
I disagree. I think the text is looking strictly at the outcome. The outcome is a society where people feel darkness is increasing. If the modern project of total liberation was working so perfectly, wouldn't we feel lighter? Wouldn't we be happier? The text argues that freedom without the discipline to integrate our nature leads to this malaise. We are free, but we are miserable. Why? Because we have discarded the structures that helped us manage our darker selves.
Which brings us to the definition of strength and discipline, the third pillar of this debate. Because if the diagnosis is we're miserable because we are free but undisciplined, the prescription really matters.
Yes. The text says clearly, integration is not indulgence. This is crucial. I think modern society heavily confuses the two. We think acknowledging our feelings means indulging every whim, every identity crisis, every grievance. We have an entire culture built on validating every emotion. The text argues that real strength comes from controlling it consciously. The instability we see is a lack of this specific type of self-knowledge. We are a society of adolescents who think acting on impulse is the same as being authentic. The author is calling for a return to stoic discipline, not to suppress the shadow, but to harness it. You acknowledge the aggression, you acknowledge the desire, but you channel it.
I agree completely with the definition of strength. The idea that acknowledging your capacity for harm doesn't mean acting on it is a timeless, essential truth. It is the distinction between being a harmless person and being a peaceful person. A peaceful person is capable of great harm, but chooses not to inflict it. A harmless person is just weak.
Exactly.
However, that's a compelling argument. But have you considered that the text frames ideological extremes as the enemy, yet arguably engages in one itself?
How so?
The text suggests we need intellectual humility, and that we should examine cultural trends critically. But is it intellectually humble to suggest that the reason birth rates are falling is because of a failure to integrate the shadow rather than, say, economic factors, housing prices, or a rational choice by women to pursue careers? I'd argue that blaming ideological influence from academia for social instability is in itself a bit of an ideological trope. It simplifies a very complex world into a story about good discipline versus bad ideology.
I don't think it's a trope if the shoe fits. The text is highlighting that we have abandoned personal responsibility in favor of systemic blame. When the text says, choose awareness and personal responsibility rather than ideological extremes, it is asking us to stop looking at society as a victim-oppressor narrative and start looking at it as a collection of individuals who need to get their own houses in order. The shadow is a part of us that wants to blame the world for our problems. The text is a call to stop doing that. If you are unhappy, don't blame the patriarchy or the institutions. Look at your own shadow.
I can certainly get on board with the call for personal responsibility. I think where we differ is just the scale. You view the text as a necessary diagnosis of a sick society. I view the text as a valuable psychological manual that is perhaps overreaching into sociology. I think you can integrate your shadow perfectly and still decide not to have children because childcare is too expensive. The shadow simply doesn't explain everything.
Then let us bring this to a conclusion, because I think that distinction is vital. I believe this text serves as a crucial warning. We cannot have social cohesion without individual psychological integration. I stand by the premise that if we continue to ignore our darker impulses and the consequences of shifting gender roles under the guise of progress, we are not heading toward utopia. We are heading toward further eruption and resentment. The decay is real, and it starts in the mirror. We cannot build a stable society on the foundation of psychological denial.
And I maintain that while the call for individual self-awareness and discipline is timeless and incredibly valuable, the listener should be wary of accepting the text's sociological diagnostics blindly. What you see as decay caused by the shadow, I see as the painful, messy, but necessary process of the rebalancing mentioned in the source material. We might be in the dark part of the cycle, but that doesn't mean the whole structure is invalid. It just means we are in the middle of the renovation, and it looks like a mess.
But we can agree that the core takeaway is the necessity of critical examination, both of oneself and of cultural trends, rather than blind acceptance.
Absolutely. Whether you see it as sickness or growth, you cannot navigate it with your eyes closed.
Thank you for listening to The Debate. We hope this discussion has illuminated the shadows of the text and perhaps a little bit of your own.
Until next time.
So I was walking down the street the other day, just a totally normal Tuesday, middle of the afternoon, and I just got this really weird feeling. You know when the air pressure drops right before a major storm hits?
Oh, yeah. The calm before the storm.
Right, exactly. Like the sky turns that really weird, sickly shade of green, and all the birds just stop singing.
Yeah, everything gets eerily quiet.
But the thing is, it wasn't the weather. It was the people. It was just the overall vibe on the sidewalk.
How do you mean?
Everyone just seemed so, I don't know, tight. Like their shoulders were up to their ears. They're staring dead-eyed at their phones, or just looking like they're ready to absolutely snap at the slightest provocation.
Yeah.
And it really got me thinking about that pervasive sense we all seem to have right now, you know, that low-level hum of anxiety that just constantly whispers that things are unstable.
It's actually really interesting you use the wither analogy, because what you're describing is an incredibly common sentiment right now. Oh, absolutely. It's a profound sense of fragility. We look at the economy or the extreme political polarization or even just the way people treat each other online.
Yeah, the internet is brutal right now.
It is. And it just feels like the ground beneath us is constantly shifting.
Exactly. And usually, you know, when we talk about this stuff, this feeling of darkness or social decay, we tend to look at external factors.
Of course.
We blame the politicians, or we blame the Fed or the massive tech companies. We're always looking for the villain out there in the world.
Which is a completely natural human instinct. I mean, we want a tangible cause we can point a finger at.
But today we are doing something very different for our deep dive. We are looking at a source that basically says, stop looking out there. The call is coming from inside the house.
And not just inside the house, but really inside the darkest, most hidden corner of the basement where you purposefully keep the lights turned off.
The scary basement. Yeah. So today's deep dive is based on this really dense, completely fascinating piece of writing titled The Integrated Shadow and the Anatomy of Social Decay.
Quite a title.
It is. And I have to say, when I first saw this in our research stack, I was honestly a bit confused because it's mashing up two completely different disciplines that usually do not go together at all.
It is a highly unique synthesis, to say the least.
Right. Because on one side, we have this deep analytical psychology, specifically Carl Jung, the shadow, the unconscious mind, you know, the heavy stuff you might talk about in intense therapy. And then on the other side, we have macroscopic sociology. We're talking birth rates, gender dynamics, the literal collapse of civilizations.
It's an incredibly ambitious bridge the author is trying to build, because usually psychologists stay in the clinic and sociologists stay strictly in their data set.
Yeah, they don't mix.
Exactly. But this source argues that you cannot actually understand the data. You cannot understand why our society currently looks the way it does without fundamentally understanding the psychological mechanism of what Jung called the shadow.
So our mission today, for everyone listening, is to see if that bridge actually holds up. We're going to dive into whether our own internal struggles, specifically the very things we repress and hide from the world, are actually the engine that is driving the external chaos we see on the news every night.
That is the core hypothesis of the text. The chaos isn't just random static. It's a reflection. It's a giant mirror.
Okay, so let's get right into it. And I think we really need to start with the absolute foundational concept here, the shadow.
Yes.
Now, I feel like I've heard this term a million times online. People are always saying things like, oh, I'm doing my shadow work, or that's just my shadow side acting up.
Yeah, it's very trendy.
It is. And to be honest, it feels a bit, I don't know, woo-woo sometimes, a bit pop psychology.
It has definitely been heavily watered down by pop culture.
Yeah.
People tend to think of the shadow as their sort of evil twin.
Like the little cartoon devil sitting on your shoulder.
Right, the little devil that secretly wants to rob banks or just be incredibly mean to the cashier at the grocery store.
A villain living inside your head.
But in strict Jungian terms, and definitely in the context of this source material, that is a massive, massive oversimplification.
Okay.
The shadow isn't just inherently evil. The shadow is simply defined as the unlived life.
The unlived life.
Yes, it is the sum of every single part of you, good, bad, or totally neutral, that you have pushed down into your unconscious mind because it just didn't fit the script.
Didn't fit the script. What exactly does that mean in practice?
Well, think about when you were a small child. You were essentially this raw ball of potential. You could be intensely angry, joyously happy, extremely loud, quiet, selfish, fiercely generous, all of it.
Just totally unfiltered.
Exactly. But then, almost immediately, you start getting feedback from your environment, from your parents, your teachers, your culture.
Right, you learn the rules.
You learn the rules. Maybe you were a young boy and you were told over and over, big boys don't cry.
So the sadness has to go somewhere.
It goes straight into the shadow. Or maybe you were a young girl and you were repeatedly told, nice girls don't raise their voices, or nice girls don't get angry.
So the assertiveness goes into the shadow.
Precisely. So your shadow becomes this sort of containment zone for everything that society or your specific family unit told you was wrong.
So the shadow is basically just a giant psychological trash bin for our socially unacceptable traits.
Or just inconvenient traits. And this is a really key point the author makes. It's not just the bad or dark stuff that gets hidden.
Really? Like good stuff gets thrown away too.
Absolutely. Think about someone who grows up in a really tough, rough neighborhood where showing any kind of vulnerability is actively dangerous.
You'd have to toughen up real fast.
You would. And in doing so, you might deeply repress your natural sensitivity, your innate kindness, maybe your profound artistic talent. In that specific case, your shadow is actually holding your absolute best qualities. The source uses this really evocative analogy of a mask.
Okay, a mask.
As we grow up, we all craft a persona. That's the mask we wear to survive, to fit in, and to get approval from the tribe. The shadow is quite simply everything that doesn't fit neatly behind that mask.
Oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense. It's like the backstage area of a theater where all the messy props are kept.
Exactly.
But here's where I get a little stuck on the author's argument. Isn't that just normal?
Normal in what sense?
Well, I mean, we obviously can't just act on every single primal impulse we have. If I'm furious at my boss, I can't just flip the conference table and start screaming.
No, that would end poorly.
Right, so isn't a certain level of repression totally necessary for a functional, civilized society to exist?
That is the million-dollar question. And it's exactly where the source makes a highly critical distinction.
What's the distinction?
The difference between suppression and repression. Or perhaps more accurately, the difference between conscious discipline and unconscious denial.
Okay, break that down for me.
The author argues that the core problem is not that we have dark or antisocial impulses that we choose not to act on.
Right.
The actual danger, the societal decay, begins when we start pretending that those impulses do not even exist in the first place.
Ah. So it's not the restraint that's the problem, it's the lie.
It is entirely the lie. The source spends a lot of time discussing this mechanism of what it calls forced virtue.
Forced virtue.
Yes. We currently live in a culture that increasingly demands to it we appear morally pristine, constantly happy, and perpetually on the right side of history at all times.
Yeah, the pressure is intense.
It is. So instead of a person consciously acknowledging, hey, I am feeling incredibly envious of my neighbor's success right now, but I'm going to choose not to act on it.
They repress it completely.
They bury it. They tell themselves, I am not envious at all. I am a perfectly good, enlightened person. I am only happy for them.
But the envy is still physically there.
It is absolutely still there. And this is where the author brings in the physics of psychology. Jung had this core idea that the human psyche is a self-regulating system, very much like the physical body.
Okay.
If you take a large inflated beach ball and you force it deep underwater,
what happens?
It pushes back against your hands, and if you slip, eventually it just shoots up out of the water in a totally random direction.
Exactly. And that violent upward surge is what the author terms a shadow eruption.
Wow.
The central argument of the text is that our current societal instability is essentially a million beach balls shooting out of the water violently, all at the exact same time.
Because we've been pushing them down for so long.
Yes. When you chronically suppress a natural human drive, whether that's aggression or tribalism or sexuality, it doesn't just vanish into thin air. It festers. It mutates in the dark.
And when it finally breaks out.
It comes out in a crude, primitive, and often highly destructive way.
So if I repress my natural assertiveness for years because I just desperately want to be seen as the nice guy, eventually I don't just naturally become assertive, I become something worse.
You become deeply resentful. You become intensely passive-aggressive. Or you might have a sudden, seemingly unprovoked explosion of violent rage over something incredibly tiny.
Like losing your mind at a barista because they put oat milk instead of almond milk in your coffee.
Exactly. That disproportionate rage is the shadow erupting. The source explicitly calls this the nice guy syndrome, but applied on a massive societal scale.
Societal nice guy syndrome. That's a concept.
We're collectively pretending to be so incredibly virtuous, so universally inclusive, so completely harmless, that we're actually building up a terrifyingly massive reservoir of resentment and rage just millimeters underneath the surface.
That is really unsettling, because it essentially implies that the nicer and more harmless we actively try to look, the more dangerous we might actually be becoming in secret.
That is the central paradox the author is trying to illuminate. He strongly argues that integration is not indulgence.
Integration is not indulgence.
Yes. And this is the specific part where most people get shadow work completely wrong. They think integrating their shadow means acting like a total jerk.
Like, I'm just living my authentic truth, man, right before they smash a car window.
Right, but that is not integration. That is just a complete lack of impulse control.
So what is true integration, then?
True integration means looking the monster directly in the eye. It means having the radical honesty to say to yourself, I possess the capacity to be violent. I have the capacity to be profoundly cruel.
Acknowledging the darkness.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because only by fully acknowledging that capacity do you actually gain the ability to consciously control it. You cannot steer a vehicle if you refuse to admit you are in the driver's seat.
That immediately reminds me of that idea. I think it's from Jordan Peterson, where he says that a harmless man is not a good man. A good man is a very dangerous man who has his danger strictly under voluntary control.
It is the exact same lineage of psychological thought. The source argues that true strength, and ultimately true societal safety, comes from deep self-awareness, not from performative harmlessness.
Because the harmlessness is fake.
More often than not, yes. Harmlessness is usually just a very convenient mask for cowardice or deep repression.
Okay, so we've got a really solid grasp on the shadow. We've got this collective beach ball being forced underwater by forced virtue. Now I want to connect this to the next major concept outlined in the article, which is toxic positivity.
Yes. The author's critique of modern optimism.
Because reading through this section, it really feels like toxic positivity is the actual mechanism, the specific tool we use to keep that beach ball pushed down.
It absolutely is. The author attacks this modern brand of relentless optimism with an absolute sledgehammer.
It's the whole good vibes only culture we see everywhere on social media.
Exactly. And look, on a superficial surface level, that sounds perfectly nice. Who on earth doesn't want good vibes?
Right. Nobody wants bad vibes.
But the source argues incredibly forcefully that a strict good vibes only mentality is actually a form of psychological totalitarianism against reality itself.
Totalitarianism against reality. That is a very heavy phrase. You need to unpack that for us.
Think about the actual nature of human existence. Real life fundamentally includes immense suffering.
It does.
It includes death, brutal betrayal, massive failures, and physical pain. If your overriding cultural mantra is simply good vibes only, you are effectively banning half of the fundamental human experience.
You're making it illegal to feel bad.
Essentially, yes. You are declaring that negative emotions, which are completely natural responses to the world, are somehow invalid or toxic.
And what's the consequence of that?
The consequence is that when real tragedy inevitably strikes, or when actual measurable societal decay sets in, you completely lack the emotional and psychological tools to deal with it honestly.
Because you've unlearned how to process anything negative.
Exactly. So your only available recourse is to double down on the denial, to force the positivity even harder.
It's literally like ignoring the bright red check engine light flashing on your car's dashboard just because you don't want the bad vibes of dealing with a broken engine.
And then, taking it a step further and putting a cheerful smiley face sticker directly over the flashing light so you don't have to look at it.
And then, obviously, the engine explodes on the highway.
And then the engine violently explodes. The author uses this exact dynamic to define what true maturity is.
How does the source define maturity?
True maturity is not defined as being perpetually happy. It is defined as possessing the fortitude to face deeply uncomfortable truths.
To look at the check engine light.
To look clearly at the check engine light. Or in a macro sense, to look directly at the rapidly declining birth rates, or the terrifying spikes in violent crime, or the epidemic-level mental health crisis, and boldly say, this is broken, this is deeply ugly. Now let us do the hard work of fixing it.
So toxic positivity is essentially medical malpractice. It's a refusal to properly diagnose the dying patient because you don't want to hurt the patient's feelings.
That is a very accurate summary of the author's stance, yes.
And this whole discussion leads perfectly into that really trippy, almost metaphysical section of the article where the author dives into the physics of light and darkness.
Yes, this is where the text introduces that very specific, heavily academic term, enantiodromia.
Enantiodromia. I swear I practiced saying that out loud in the mirror 3 times this morning before we started.
You nailed it.
Thank you. But what does it actually mean?
It's an ancient Greek concept that Carl Jung borrowed and used quite heavily in his writing. The literal translation roughly means running counter to.
Okay.
The core philosophical idea is that any extreme position, any cultural or psychological movement, if it is pushed too far in one single direction, will inevitably turn into its exact opposite.
Turn into its exact opposite. I think I need a concrete, real-world example to wrap my head around that.
Let's look at it politically. Think about a hypothetical government that becomes completely obsessed with creating a society of perfect safety.
Okay, pure safety, no crime.
Right. So to achieve that perfect safety, they start installing high-definition cameras on every single street corner. They begin aggressively monitoring all private online speech. They preemptively arrest anyone who looks remotely suspicious.
Right.
They push the virtue of safety to its absolute extreme logical limit. What kind of society do they actually create?
They create a totalitarian police state, which is utterly terrifying and fundamentally unsafe for the average citizen. So the extreme pursuit of safety literally flips into extreme danger and oppression.
Exactly. The virtue becomes a vice.
Right.
Or, on a more individual level, take a person who develops a crippling obsession with being physically pure and clean.
Like a germaphobe.
Yes. They scrub their hands raw every 5 minutes. They sanitize every surface. They basically live in a sealed plastic bubble. They push the concept of hygiene to the absolute extreme. What physically happens to their body?
Their immune system completely crashes because it has absolutely zero bacteria to practice fighting against.
Precisely. Extreme purity inevitably becomes extreme vulnerability to deadly disease. That is enantiodromia in action.
That is absolutely fascinating. So the author's core argument here is that our modern society has pushed certain modern virtues so far past the point of reason that they are actively flipping into destructive vices.
That is the absolute crux of the entire thesis. We, as a culture, pushed incredibly hard for radical tolerance, which is initially a positive correction.
But perhaps we pushed it so far that we hit a tipping point, and it enantiodromically flipped into a vicious intolerance of any dissenting views. The paradox of tolerance.
Yes. Or we push relentlessly for absolute individual freedom and autonomy, removing all traditional obligations. And maybe that is flipped into a society paralyzed by profound isolation and loneliness. The pendulum never simply stops in the middle. It always swings back with equal force.
And so all the massive societal chaos we are feeling right now, that weird tense vibe on the street I was talking about earlier, that is just the historical pendulum violently swinging back.
The author suggests exactly that. The current social turmoil is not necessarily the end of the world. It's a psychological rebalancing process.
It's like breaking a fever.
Exactly like a fever.
Right.
You don't get a severe fever because your body is fundamentally broken. You get a fever because your body is desperately trying to burn out a virus. The cultural chaos is just society desperately trying to find a new equilibrium after swinging way too far into extreme, unbalanced territory.
Okay. I want to take a brief pause right here. Because we have done a ton of the really heavy internal work, we've thoroughly mapped the individual psyche and the shadow.
We have.
But the core promise of this deep dive, the reason you are all listening right now, was to connect this internal psychology to the big, scary, macroscopic sociological trends. The macro mirror, as the author calls it.
The great shift from the micro to the macro.
Yes, and I have to play devil's advocate for a second. How do we actually get there? Because making the leap from me personally repressing my anger at work all the way to nationwide social decay and the collapse of institutions, it feels like a massive stretch.
It definitely feels like a stretch right up until you fully understand the psychological mechanism of projection. This is the crucial bridge between the individual and the society.
Projection. Okay, walk us across that bridge.
When you stubbornly deny the shadow material within yourself, you do not just sit on it quietly. The psyche demands a release valve. So you project that denied darkness outward onto other people.
I project it onto you.
Yes. If I absolutely refuse to admit to myself that I am deeply selfish, I will magically start seeing extreme selfishness everywhere I look.
You'll see it in me, in the barista, everywhere.
Exactly. I will become utterly convinced that you're out to get me, that the government is stealing from me, that my boss is hoarding resources. I systematically export my own internal unacknowledged conflict directly onto the external world.
So if I am actively refusing to deal with my own personal demons, my brain will just invent external demons for me to fight in the real world instead.
Precisely. It is a defense mechanism to protect your ego. And now, I want you to scale that exact mechanism up to a population of 330 million people. If you have an entire society populated by people who are fiercely committed to appearing nice and virtuous on the surface, but are absolutely boiling with repressed rage, tribalism, and shadow material underneath, what do they inevitably do?
They form incredibly rigid tribes. They lock onto a political enemy.
Yes, and they collectively point across the aisle and declare, "We are the virtuous, enlightened ones. They are the absolute monsters. They are the threat to democracy."
Oh, wow. So you're saying the extreme political polarization we are seeing everywhere isn't actually about policy disagreements at all. It's fundamentally about psychological dumping.
According strictly to the arguments presented in the source material, yes. We are actively using modern politics as a giant societal garbage can for our collective shadow.
That is wild.
We dump all of our heavily repressed hatred, our latent aggression, and our deep intolerance entirely onto the other side. Because by doing that, we get to experience the thrill of those dark emotions while still safely telling ourselves that we are the good guys.
We can scream and hate and try to ruin people's lives, but it's totally justified because we were only doing it to the bad guys.
Exactly. It perfectly explains the sheer religious intensity of modern political discourse. It explains why you can almost never just have a polite, normal disagreement about tax rates or zoning laws anymore. Every single debate instantly escalates into a totally apocalyptic holy war.
Because it's not actually about tax rates, it's about the soul. It's about millions of people desperately, frantically trying to avoid facing their own internal darkness by projecting it outward and fighting it in the streets.
That is the author's exact diagnosis of our political climate.
All right, that is one hell of a bridge. And now that we have officially crossed it, we are fully entering the second half of the article.
Yes, the anatomy of the decay itself.
And I will be completely honest with everyone listening, the source material pulls absolutely no punches from here on out. The author dives headfirst into highly sensitive topics. We are talking gender roles, global birth rates, and the fundamental structure of the nuclear family.
The author certainly goes there. And we should strongly caveat this entire upcoming section for the listener. We are impartially reporting on the specific arguments and sociological critiques laid out by the author of this text.
Right, we aren't taking sides here.
Exactly. This text presents a very sharp critique of several modern values, and it is going to directly challenge some deeply held assumptions about what we generally label as inevitable societal progress.
So let's start with the hard data point that anchors this entire back half of the text, the rapidly declining birth rate.
The global demographic collapse. The author points out the undeniable statistical reality that we are currently seeing birth rates plummet well below the necessary replacement level across almost the entirety of the developed world.
It's everywhere. South Korea, Japan, almost all of Europe, the United States.
Yes, the numbers are incredibly stark.
And usually the mainstream explanation for this drop is almost entirely economic, right? People say, well, having kids is just too expensive now, or the housing market is totally inaccessible for young couples.
Right. And the author acknowledges that those economic realities are absolutely contributing factors. But the source argues very firmly that if the root cause was purely economic, then the absolute wealthiest demographics in society would naturally have the highest number of children.
But they don't.
They don't. In fact, it is often the exact inverse. Therefore, the author concludes, the primary driving force behind the demographic collapse is not economic. It is deeply cultural.
And this is where the author connects the birth rate decline directly to the massive shift in gender roles over the last century, and specifically to the shadow of female empowerment.
Yes.
Okay, this is the very sensitive part. Is the author of this piece essentially arguing that female empowerment and feminism have been a net negative for society?
No, and this is exactly where we need to be incredibly nuanced in our reading of the text.
Yeah.
The author is absolutely not saying that women should abandon the workforce and go back to the kitchen.
Okay, good. So what is the argument?
He is attempting to analyze the vast systemic trade-offs of an unprecedented cultural shift. The argument is grounded in evolutionary history. For roughly 99% of human existence, the absolute primary survival mechanism of our species was the cohesive family unit.
Which was driven by a very strict, biologically determined division of labor.
Exactly. The classic provider and nurturer model. Now, over just the last 60 years, which is less than a blink of an eye in evolutionary time, we have almost completely dismantled that ancient script.
We opened up higher education, the corporate workforce, and financial independence to women on a mass scale.
Yes. And the author explicitly frames that massive expansion of rights and opportunities as a profound liberation. That is the light side of the equation.
But where there is light, there must be a shadow.
Exactly. The shadow of that specific liberation, according to the deeply held view of the author, has been the rapid destabilization of the fundamental family structure.
The classic law of unintended consequences.
Precisely. If a society actively encourages its entire female population to heavily prioritize advanced career building and complete financial independence during their peak fertile years, that society will inevitably, mathematically, produce significantly fewer children.
It's just cause and effect.
Yes. But the deeper, far more controversial psychological argument the author is making here relies once again on the concept of overcorrection.
Enantiodromia rears its head again.
Indeed. The author argues that we collectively looked at the very real, very rigid restrictions placed on women in the past, and we rightly concluded that is bad.
So we swung the giant cultural pendulum as hard as we could to the exact opposite side.
We declared that total, atomized independence is the ultimate good. But now, decades later, the author argues we're suffering from the shadow of that total independence.
Which manifests as what?
It manifests as widespread social isolation, a devastating lack of local community cohesion, and a rapidly approaching demographic winter that legitimately threatens the long-term viability of the entire global economy.
It's that core idea again. You cannot just change one massive foundational variable in an incredibly complex system without accidentally breaking something else down the line.
Exactly. And the author's incredibly grim assessment is that we have absolutely not figured out how to fix what we broke yet. We are currently just living amidst the wreckage of this massive historical transition.
That is heavy. Now, the article doesn't just focus on women. It spends an equal amount of time discussing the profound impact of all this on men. Specifically, it dives into the erosion of what it calls male spaces and traditional male identity.
Yes, this is the vital other side of the sociological coin. The author argues that as society focused intensely and necessary, he notes on empowering and uplifting women, we inadvertently, almost accidentally, began to heavily pathologize innate masculinity.
We started applying labels to things.
Yes. We began taking traditional, biologically driven male traits, things like physical aggression, high competitiveness, risk-taking, even stoicism, and we started broadly labeling them all as inherently toxic.
The endless discourse around toxic masculinity, we literally hear that phrase every single day now.
We do, but the source asks a vital psychological question. If you relentlessly tell an entire generation of young boys that their most basic natural instincts are fundamentally toxic and unwanted by society, what actually happens?
Well, they don't just magically stop being men.
No, they don't. Instead, they retreat. They take all of that masculine energy and they push it straight down into the shadow.
And we get the phenomenon of the lost boys.
Exactly. We see the massive dropout crisis in higher education. Millions of young men simply leaving the labor force entirely. A massive retreat from dating and starting families.
The author draws a very direct, unbroken line between the modern erosion of male utility, that primal, necessary feeling that a man is actually needed by a community as a provider and a protector, and the terrifyingly steep rise in male suicide, addiction, and deep-seated political resentment.
It all routes right back to the shadow mechanism. If a society utterly fails to provide a young man with a highly constructive, socially celebrated way to be dangerous, like bravely protecting a family or undertaking a difficult trade or building a high-risk business, he will inevitably find a deeply destructive way to be dangerous.
Or, as the author points out, he will just entirely sedate himself with endless video games and high-speed internet porn, which the text essentially equates to a form of slow, quiet suicide.
The author forcefully argues that modern society has completely stripped away the classic hero's journey script for young men. And worse, we replaced it with a script that simply points a finger and says, "You are the historical problem."
And then society acts completely shocked and bewildered when this massive cohort of young men becomes highly destabilized and angry.
Exactly.
So, to synthesize this massive section, the author essentially identifies a very specific trio of influence as the primary drivers of all this social decay.
Yes, the three pillars.
We've got the advent of modern contraception, the changing gender roles we just discussed, and finally, ideological influence.
Let's briefly break those down to be thorough. First, contraception.
The birth control pill.
The author views this not just as a medical advancement, but as an earth-shattering technological shock. By completely severing the biological link between sexual intimacy and procreation, it fundamentally changed the very concept of the family.
It transformed the family from an inevitable biological destiny into a highly optional consumer choice.
Exactly. And the author argues this is quite possibly the single biggest, most disruptive behavioral shift in the entire history of the human species. It completely rewired the underlying incentive structure for all male and female relationships.
Okay, the second pillar is changing gender roles, which we just spent a lot of time breaking down. The massive societal friction of trying to rewrite thousands of years of evolutionary scripts in real time.
Yes. And that brings us to the third and final pillar, ideological influence. Here, the author points a very steady critical finger directly at the modern university system and the legacy media.
The institutions he refers to as the super spreaders?
That's the term. He strongly argues that these massive cultural shifts, the dismantling of gender norms, the devaluing of the nuclear family, they didn't just happen organically out of nowhere.
They were actively pushed.
They were heavily subsidized and pushed by institutions that held a very specific ideological commitment to systematically dismantling all traditional social structures, primarily because those structures were uniformly viewed through an academic lens as inherently oppressive.
And what is the author's primary critique of that academic deconstruction?
His core critique is that while the institutions were incredibly successful at tearing everything down, the desperately needed reconstruction simply has not happened.
We aggressively tore down the old traditional house because we decided the windows were too drafty and the floorboards creaked.
But we completely failed to build a new house to replace it. And now, the entire society is basically sleeping out in the freezing rain, wondering why everyone is getting so sick.
That is a wildly powerful, incredibly bleak image, but it rings very true. We currently live in a dominant culture of endless deconstruction. We are all so unbelievably good at taking concepts apart, finding the flaws, and loudly pointing out why everything is problematic.
We have infinite labels for it.
Right. Oh, that's sexist, that's deeply colonialist, that's inherently racist. But we seem utterly incapable of actually building new institutions or new social scripts that genuinely function in the real world.
Because fundamentally, the act of building requires massive personal sacrifice. It demands that you willingly limit your endless personal options. It requires firmly committing to a specific social script and sticking to it, even when it is incredibly difficult.
And our modern collective shadow is that we absolutely refuse to let go of any of our precious options.
Exactly. The modern ego demands everything, everywhere, all at once, with absolutely zero negative trade-offs. And the blunt reality is that you cannot physically build a stable, enduring civilization on that foundation.
Wow. So, this is incredibly heavy.
It is a lot to process.
We've covered a terrifying demographic collapse, a profound, agonizing crisis of meaning for both men and women, and a hypertoxic political environment entirely fueled by unconscious psychological projection. If I'm a listener sitting at home right now, I'm probably thinking, okay, great, the world is ending, we are totally doomed. Thanks a lot for ruining my week. Deep dive.
I know it sounds remarkably dark, but we have to remember the actual title of the source material. It is called The Integrated Shadow. The ultimate goal of this deeply challenging text is not to induce a state of paralyzed despair.
It's not nihilism.
No, the explicit goal is to induce absolute clarity.
So having diagnosed all this decay, what is the actual path forward? How on earth do we stop or reverse this massive societal rot?
The core solution the author presents loops us all the way back to the very beginning of our conversation. It comes back entirely to the individual psyche.
Really? Just the individual?
Yes. The author is intensely clear on this point. You cannot ever solve a deeply rooted macro-sociological problem using blunt, top-down macro solutions.
You can't just pass a sweeping federal law that magically forces men to find deep existential meaning, or pass a tax credit that instantly convinces millions of people to suddenly start having big families again.
Precisely. It doesn't work that way. The true healing has to start at the bottom. It has to start down in the dark basement of your own mind.
It has to start with integration.
It has to start with rigorous personal integration. The absolute first necessary step is to systematically withdraw all of your outward psychological projections.
What does that look like practically?
It means you have to consciously, forcefully stop blaming the patriarchy or the woke mob or the immigrants or the evil billionaires for your own deep internal sense of anxiety and unease.
You have to fully own your own shadow.
You have to own every terrible piece of it. You have to bravely acknowledge that you personally possess the exact capacity for all the horrible things you so intensely hate in other people.
Right. If you are constantly raging online about how the world is entirely driven by greedy people, you have to stop and aggressively examine exactly where you are acting greedily in your own private life.
Exactly. If you are terrified that society is becoming far too hateful and intolerant, you have to sit quietly and look at precisely who you are harboring deep hatred for.
Honestly, that sounds less like psychology and more like deep, painful spiritual work.
At its highest level, it is spiritual work,
Mm-hmm.
but it has a very real, measurable sociological effect. The math is quite simple. If enough individual citizens commit to the hard work of stopping their projections and integrating their shadows, the overall temperature of the entire society slowly begins to drop.
The fever starts to break.
The apocalyptic polarization shatters. Because once you integrate your shadow, you finally realize that the fundamental line between ultimate good and ultimate evil doesn't neatly run down the aisle between two warring political parties.
It runs straight down the middle of every single human heart.
Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
Solzhenitsyn, I thought so.
And that profound realization is what the author ultimately defines as true societal strength. Genuine strength is never about screaming the loudest on a protest line.
What is it then?
True strength is the psychological ability to constantly hold the immense tension of opposites, to be completely soberly aware of the terrifying darkness that exists within yourself and the world, and yet to consciously, deliberately choose to act toward the light anyway.
It really all just comes down to discipline.
Discipline is the ultimate antidote to decay,
Yeah.
and not the rigid, unthinking discipline of a military drill sergeant, but the incredibly difficult internal discipline of total awareness. The daily practice of catching yourself exactly in the moment when you desperately want to look away from an ugly, uncomfortable truth and violently forcing yourself to keep your eyes open.
So this grand rebalancing process that the author theorizes about, this massive fever break, it literally only happens one single person at a time.
It is the only way genuine, lasting historical change has ever happened. A society is ultimately just the aggregate sum of its individual parts.
Right. If the parts themselves are totally broken and rotting, the entire machine fails.
But if the individual parts actively choose to heal themselves, the entire machine slowly begins to heal.
Man, that is a brilliantly sobering thought, because it strips away all of our excuses and puts the heavy responsibility for the future of civilization right back squarely onto our own individual shoulder.
We absolutely cannot just tweet our way out of this crisis.
No, you actually have to live your way out of it.
Yeah.
Well, we have covered an absolutely massive arc today. I mean, we started with just a weird feeling of tension on a Tuesday afternoon sidewalk, went plunging into the deepest, darkest parts of Jungian clinical psychology, and somehow ended up charting global demographic collapse and the literal future survival of Western civilization.
It is a tremendous amount of highly dense material for anyone to digest.
It really is. But if there is one single overarching takeaway I want you all to walk away with today, it is this deeply profound concept of the mirror. Everything we are witnessing out there in the chaotic world is ultimately just showing us exactly what is unresolved in here.
And if you find that you deeply despise what you are seeing in that mirror, You cannot fix it by trying to smash the glass. You have to do the grueling work of changing the face, staring back at it.
I absolutely love that. Okay, before we completely wrap up this session, we always like to leave you, the listener, with a specific question to mull over, something provocative to explore on your own time that builds on all this source material.
Yes, and I have a very specific one in mind today. We have talked extensively during this hour about the concept of a shadow eruption, how the painful truths we continually suppress will always, inevitably, violently break the surface.
Right.
So my direct question for you to consider is this. Look very closely at your own life. Look at the dynamics of your own family, your specific friend group, or the culture of your workplace. What is the one specific, undeniable truth that everyone in that group is desperately trying not to say out loud? What is the massive, heavy elephant in the room that you are all politely, collectively ignoring to maintain a false peace?
That's a great question. And the terrifying follow-up to that is, what exactly is going to happen when that suppressed truth finally stands up, shatters the silence, and absolutely demands to be heard? Because, as we've learned today, it eventually will.
It always does.
Thank you so much for taking this really intense deep dive with us today. It was definitely a heavy, challenging one, but I truly believe it's an absolutely necessary conversation to have right now.
I couldn't agree more. Stay integrated, everyone.
We will see you next time.